Hey everyone, and today we're going to study Psalm 64 in this book. And this one came up with a few surprises for me, and I thought it was really interesting. If I didn't have this commentary, I would never have known what this chapter of Psalms was even about. So let's get right into it. This psalm is actually a prayer that King David composed while fleeing from Saul, like many of the other psalms. But what's different about it is that he is condemning those who slandered him falsely to Saul. So people told gossip to King Saul, which is what made King Saul, dislike David. And so, based on the slander and gossip, there were those who wanted to kill King David and usurp his power. The commentators say that this psalm is actually David's prophetic prayer on behalf of his descendant, the prophet Daniel. And I would have never known this from reading the surface level of this chapter. It's so fascinating, and you'll see in each verse the allusions to something that was going to happen in the future. And also, I've seen that in other Psalms, King David prophesies future events like the story of Queen Esther and what happened there. And there's many parallels here, which we'll see in a moment. To understand this psalm's references to Daniel, some familiarity with the events is necessary. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Daniel in order to understand this chapter of Psalms. Daniel was a vizier. I had to look this up. It means a high official in places in Arab lands like Turkey, to King Darius of Persia. As he gained the king's respect and favor, the officers grew jealous and plotted his downfall. So this sounds a lot like Mordecai and the Esther story. They approached the king and advised him to make a decree that would solidify his rule. They suggested that the king forbid prayer to any other entity other than to the king for 30 days, and that violators be cast into a den of lions. Yet Daniel continued to pray towards Jerusalem. So he's living in Persia, which is now Iran, and he prayed facing Jerusalem. So he did that for 3 times a day. When the officers exposed him to the king had no choice but to follow through with his own decree. So once a king puts his stamp and seal on an edict, that's it. Even if it doesn't make sense or he wants to retract it, a decree is a decree. Daniel was cast into the pit, but miraculously survived. So he was cast into a pit of lions. Darius rejoiced, and the schemers were given the punishment they imposed on Daniel. So very similar to the Queen Esther story, where Haman was given the punishment that he decreed for Mordecai. The incident is recorded in Daniel, which is in the book of Prophets, chapter 6. So in verse 2, King David says, "Hear my voice, O God, as I recount my woes." So David is referring to Daniel. He prays in the first person because Daniel was a descendant of his. Furthermore, in verse 7, King David says, "They sought pretexts. And when they completed a diligent search, each man kept the plot inside, deep in the heart." So what this is referring to is that the diligent search is referring to the search of Daniel's enemies to find some condemnable flaw in Daniel. So some reason that would justify their hatred and their jealousy and then cause his demise and downfall. Then the viziers and the satraps, which are the high officials in the Persian Empire, sought to find a pretext to use against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could not find any pretext or fault because he was trustworthy. So he was a good guy. They couldn't find any reason to ensnare him. And no error or fault was found about him. Finding none, they resorted to plotting against his religion. So they found a way to make him, have a bad outcome, a bad fate. And so verse 8 says, God hurled them. So it's referring to into the lion's den in place of Daniel. So here's the story. When Daniel emerged from the pit unharmed, his enemies suggested to the king that Daniel was spared because the lions were not hungry. The king didn't fall for it. He's no fool. The king replied, "If the lions are sated, you go down and spend the night with them, and we will see if they are sated." As soon as they were thrown in, the lions devoured them. So the truth is that it's not that the lions didn't eat because they weren't hungry. Daniel had a holiness about him that protected him from the lions, whereas these evildoers did not. They did not have that protection. So thus God hurled them like a sudden arrow were their blows. And lastly, verse 9 out of these 11 verses, their own tongues caused them to stumble. So their own plot against Daniel led to their own deaths. So just like Mordecai and Haman plotted against Mordecai in the Queen Esther story, and his plot was actually used against himself. And he was hung from the gallows that he had created for Mordecai. Alternatively, their own tongues, which suggested to the king that the lions were not hungry, caused them to stumble, meaning caused the king to test their theory and throw them to the lions. There's also another story similar to this in Daniel chapter 3 verse 16, where 3 men were thrown into a fire pit, and they also miraculously survived. So this is a very fascinating historical psalm, and let's see what, if any, lessons we can extract from here. I guess one thing is that if you are a person of faith and an upright person and a good person, that even when people are plotting harm against you, that to have faith that God will protect you from harm. And so we should do our best so that others will not find flaws within our behavior. All right, thanks so much for watching. God bless you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.